What if the darkest punishments in ancient history were not ordered by men at all, but by queens whose names were later scrubbed clean or turned into monsters? You have been taught to picture ruthless kings and mad emperors. Tonight we walk into a different throne room where the hand that signs the death warrant wears delicate jewelry, and the voice that orders the execution is calm, measured, and unmistakably female. For centuries, chroniclers, priests, and court historians worked hard to sell you one idea, that women were naturally gentler, more merciful, made for nurturing, not for blood. Yet buried in the archives there are stories that do not fit. A queen in Madagascar who turned poison into a legal trial that could wipe out whole communities. A Tudor queen who watched flames rise around hundreds of bodies in the name of religious purity. An empress in Constantinople who solved a political problem by having men of her own dynasty permanently blinded. These are not legends. They are recorded, debated, uncomfortable facts. Here is the question nobody asks out loud. When a woman reaches the very top of a violent system built by men, what does she have to do to keep that throne? Does she become softer than the kings who came before her, or does she learn to speak the only language the palace truly respects, the language of fear and punishment? Often, the answer is written not in speeches, but in the bodies of those who crossed her. Public executions. Ordeals that looked religious, but functioned like terror. Punishments designed not just to hurt, but to send a message that would echo through villages, marketplaces, and royal courts for generations. Here, we open 5 of those cases, 5 moments in which female leaders chose punishments so severe that even their enemies paused before challenging them again. Each story comes from a different culture and a different century. As you listen, you will start to notice patterns, how religion is used as a shield, how justice becomes theater, how the image of the cruel woman is sometimes a weapon invented by her enemies, and sometimes a mask she deliberately puts on. And while we talk about queens and empresses, this is not only about them. It is about how power behaves when it feels threatened, and what happens when someone who was never meant to rule decides not only to rule, but to survive at any cost. You may find yourself disturbed, fascinated, even conflicted as you hear what they ordered other human beings to endure. That reaction matters. It exposes the gap between the stories you were given and the ones that were carefully kept from you. Before we dive into the first of these sentences, I want to know what this awakens in you. Have you ever noticed how often history paints powerful women as either saints or monsters, with nothing in between? If this kind of look at the past helps you see power with new eyes, take a moment to write in the comments what shocked you already, tap like, and check if you are subscribed to stay with this journey. Keep that tension in mind as we step closer to the first throne room, and to the punishment that turned a woman's authority into calculated terror. The moment we step deeper into this world, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Violence was never random in ancient courts. It was a currency, a language, and often the only tool a ruler had to rewrite the rules of a kingdom that doubted her. When a woman ascended a throne built by warriors, priests, generals, and patriarchs, every eye turned to her expecting weakness. And because weakness could get her killed, she learned to weaponize justice in ways that appear ruthless to us today, but made perfect political sense inside those walls of gold, incense, and paranoia. In many ancient societies, a female leader was already an anomaly, sometimes tolerated, sometimes feared, often watched with suspicion. She inherited not only authority, but also a stage, one where every gesture mattered. A punishment was never just a punishment. It was a message delivered to friend and enemy alike. A queen could not rely on brute force alone the way a male conqueror could. Instead, she mastered symbolic violence, punishment that carried meaning beyond pain. A ritual that looked sacred but was engineered to intimidate, a public display designed to erase doubt, a sentence that reinforced divine legitimacy. And because she existed in the gap between expectation and rejection, her decisions were recorded with sharper ink, preserved as proof that she was either too cruel or not cruel enough, depending on who told the story. When we explore these ancient contexts, we find that many punishments attributed to women were shaped by the worlds they ruled. In societies with strong religious structures, a queen might use sacred ordeals because they granted authority she could not earn through physical dominance. In militarized empires, a queen might order severe public penalties because they mirrored the brutality already woven into the culture. And in courts ruled by gossip, spies, and dynastic rivalry, she might respond with precision, removing threats through punishments that looked merciless but were, in reality, calculated acts of survival. Records from Asia, North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East show a similar pattern. The more contested a woman's claim to the throne was, the harsher her justice tended to appear. Chroniclers often emphasized her punishments, more than her policies, fascinated by the clash between feminine expectation and decisive power. The same actions that appeared firm when done by kings became monstrous when ordered by queens. This double standard shaped the way history remembered them, amplifying their brutality while diminishing the forces that cornered them into making such choices. Understanding this context is essential before we examine the first punishment itself. These women did not operate in a vacuum. Every decree they issued was born from tension, between tradition and threat, between legitimacy and rebellion, between survival and annihilation. Their punishments reflected not only their personal character, but also the dangerous architecture of the world around them. And once we recognize the pressures that forge their decisions, the stories of their ruthless sentences begin to reveal something far more complex than cruelty. They reveal strategies, warnings, and the psychology of rulers who balanced on the edge of power that was never fully theirs to hold, yet they held it anyway, often at unimaginable cost. Let's move closer to the first case, where the queen's decision was not driven by impulse, but by the need to send a message that would outlive her own breath. The first case unfolds in a palace where betrayal was not an exception, but a daily possibility, whispered behind silk curtains and carved wooden screens. The queen at the center of this moment understood that loyalty in her court was fragile, often performed rather than practiced. She became ruler in a climate shaped by ambition, where generals, advisors, and even relatives looked at her crown as an invitation to test the limits of her authority. Her response to the earliest signs of conspiracy would determine not only her reputation, but her survival. Historical fragments describe how she discovered that several trusted figures were quietly aligning with a foreign power, plotting to remove her before she could solidify her rule. These were not minor players. One was a high-ranking official with access to military strategy. Another controlled trade routes that supplied essential resources to the capital. They believed a female ruler would be easier to manipulate or replace, and they moved carefully, using coded messages, private meetings, and bribes to build momentum. But she was not blind. Instead of confronting them immediately, she observed, documented, and waited for the precise moment when exposing them would carry the greatest impact. When proof finally surfaced, she did not choose a discreet execution or quiet exile. Those punishments would have whispered fear. She needed the result to thunder. She ordered a form of punishment that was designed not only to eliminate the threat, but to etch a permanent warning into the consciousness of every noble who watched the event unfold. Some accounts describe public interrogations followed by brutal sentencing, meant to humiliate the traitors before the final blow. Others note that the punishment involved a ritualistic component, linking their betrayal to an offense against the gods, turning their crime into a cosmic violation rather than a political misstep. What made this decision so shocking was not just the severity of the punishment, but the precision of its staging. She held the event in a central courtyard, a place associated with royal announcements and celebrations. Servants, soldiers, diplomats, and visiting dignitaries were all present, creating an audience far larger than usual for such matters. As the conspirators were brought forward, the queen did not hide behind her attendants or retreat to an elevated balcony. She remained visible, emotionally controlled, and entirely unshaken. That image alone shifted the atmosphere in the court. It signaled that she understood the rules of power as clearly as any king before her, and that she would not allow hesitation to define her reaction. The punishment itself was crafted to dismantle the conspirators' influence. It targeted not only their bodies, but their social status, their memory, and their alliances. Some of their lands were seized. Their families were publicly distanced from the crime. Their names were recorded in official documents as examples of the consequences of treason. Even those who were spared execution faced penalties so severe that generations later, their descendants still carried the stigma. The queen's decision spoke loudly to every faction. Inside the palace, she was not a symbolic ruler, not a placeholder, and certainly not someone whose authority could be tested without devastating consequences. This moment marked a turning point. For the first time, the nobles realized that she would not allow her gender to define the limits of her power. She used the conspirators' fate to build a narrative that protected her throne. Betrayal against her was betrayal against the stability of the realm itself. And as the crowd dispersed, the message lingered, heavy and unmistakable, shaping the political climate for years to come. The second case takes us into a kingdom where religion was not merely a belief system, but the scaffolding of political life. Here, the queen ruled alongside priests who guarded sacred traditions with a fervor that could turn even minor offenses into cosmic crimes. She understood early that the legitimacy of her reign depended on more than military presence or diplomatic alliances. It depended on convincing her people that the gods themselves supported her authority. And so she learned to fuse justice with ritual, weaving punishment into ceremonies that carried the weight of divine judgment. The crime in question began modestly, at least on the surface. A group of officials had defied one of her decrees, redirecting temple funds and manipulating sacred offerings to strengthen their faction within the court. It was corruption, certainly, but also a challenge to the spiritual hierarchy that defined the kingdom. They believed they could twist religious law to weaken her influence, assuming that a female ruler would hesitate to confront the priesthood head-on. But they miscalculated. She knew that a ruler who lost control of ritual lost control of the throne itself, and she moved with a clarity that surprised even her closest advisors. Instead of sentencing them through traditional legal channels, she announced that the gods would decide their fate. A public ritual was set at the main temple square, a massive stone platform decorated with carved symbols and encircled by torches that burned even in daylight. The atmosphere was deliberately constructed to intensify fear. Drums echoed, smoke curled from censers, and priests recited invocations that emphasized purity, truth, and divine wrath. The accused were brought forward not as political rebels, but as souls whose sincerity would be tested by sacred forces. The ordeal she chose was known for its psychological brutality. While the specifics varied across records, most agree that it required the accused to undergo a ritual exposure to an element believed to reveal guilt through its effects on the body. It was a trial designed to appear impartial, yet everyone understood that the outcome was shaped by the queen's orchestration of the environment. The symbolism mattered more than the mechanics. By placing the judgment in the hands of the gods, she reframed the conflict. She was not punishing her enemies. She was simply allowing the divine order to restore itself. Crowds gathered, filling the temple grounds until the stone steps overflowed with spectators. The ritual unfolded with chilling precision. Priests performed chants, witnesses signed statements, and royal scribes recorded each stage with ceremonial care. When the ordeal concluded and the accused collapsed under the strain, the verdict seemed irrefutable. The gods had spoken. The queen did not have to raise her voice or deliver a speech. Her authority expanded not through force, but through her mastery of symbolism, showing the people that she could command not just soldiers, but the spiritual machinery of the kingdom. The punishment that followed drew its power from this illusion of divine neutrality. The officials lost their positions, their property, and in some cases, their freedom. More importantly, they lost the aura of moral authority they had used to undermine her. The public saw the queen as the protector of sacred order, not the architect of their downfall. By embedding the punishment within ritual, she insulated herself from accusations of cruelty and established a precedent that future challengers feared to test again. This event marked a shift both inside and outside the palace. Those who once relied on religious symbolism to manipulate politics now understood that she could wield that same symbolism with greater precision. She had turned divine judgment into an extension of her rule, merging piety and power into a single instrument that shaped the kingdom's perception of justice. And as the echoes of the ceremony faded, the lesson remained. In her hands, even the sacred could become a weapon wrapped in reverence. Before we move onward, I want to hear from you. What do you think about rulers who use ritual and religion to justify punishment? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about how this kind of power shapes justice in any era. The third case leads us into a realm where punishment became a form of spectacle, a deliberate performance crafted to mold public perception. This queen understood better than most that fear was not enough on its own. It had to be directed, shaped, and displayed. Her kingdom was large, diverse, and constantly shifting, filled with factions competing for influence. In such an environment, a simple decree often failed to reach the hearts of the people. But a public punishment, staged with precision and intention, could transform a ruler's message into something unforgettable. The crime involved a governor stationed in a strategically vital province. For years, he had quietly built a personal network of loyalty, diverting resources, manipulating regional laws, and creating a pocket of power that operated almost independently from the crown. His ambition was known, but difficult to prove. It was only when his actions threatened to disrupt military supply lines that the queen moved decisively. Instead of dispatching soldiers to capture him discreetly, she orchestrated a dramatic arrest during a ceremonial gathering, ensuring that witnesses from multiple provinces saw the event unfold in real time. Her choice of execution site was provocative. She selected a vast amphitheater typically used for celebrations, festivals, and announcements of victory. By placing the punishment in a space associated with triumph and communal experience, she sent a message about the nature of the crime. This was not merely an act of disobedience. It was an offense that jeopardized the stability and unity of the realm. The stage was transformed overnight. Banners displaying royal symbols hung from the stands, torches burned in rigid alignment, and performers who typically entertained the public were replaced with soldiers in full ceremonial armor. As the governor was brought forward, the queen's presence was unmistakable. She did not speak loudly or dramatically. Instead, she allowed silence to work in her favor. The amphitheater, usually filled with music and laughter, now held a tension so sharp it felt like a blade. When the punishment was announced, it unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. Every movement had symbolic weight: the placement of guards, the reading of his crimes, the method chosen to end his influence. Chroniclers described the crowd as frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing justice, propaganda, or both. What set this moment apart was the queen's mastery of narrative control. She ensured that scribes documented not only the governor's crimes, but also the reactions of the public. The punishment became a story that traveled farther than any soldier could march. Written accounts circulated through marketplaces, temples, and military encampments, framing the event as a heroic defense of the empire, rather than an act of vengeance. Even those who disliked her could not deny the effectiveness of her strategy. She had turned a political threat into a cautionary tale, embedding it into the social memory of the kingdom. The impact of the spectacle did not end with the governor's demise. His associates distanced themselves, abandoning their ambitions in favor of survival. Regional leaders realigned their loyalties, recognizing that the queen's power extended beyond the palace walls and into the very stories people told about the realm. By controlling the narrative surrounding punishment, she influenced not only the behavior of elites, but also the fears and expectations of ordinary citizens. Power, in her hands, became a form of theater, both captivating and terrifying. This case reveals how a ruler can reshape perception through carefully orchestrated displays, transforming punishment into a tool of psychological dominance. And as we move to the next example, the pattern grows sharper. Violence in the hands of a strategic leader becomes more than physical force. It becomes a message designed to echo through generations. The fourth case carries us into a frontier shaped by war, where the queen's authority extended over territories held together by fragile alliances and constant military pressure. Unlike rulers who governed from the comfort of central palaces, she spent much of her reign navigating border conflicts, rebellions, and rival tribes who viewed her accession as an opportunity to fracture the realm. To maintain control in such an environment, she relied on a different kind of punishment, one that served not only to eliminate defiance, but to reshape how entire regions perceived her strength. The conflict began with a rising insurgency in a recently conquered territory. Its leaders believed that a female sovereign would be hesitant to take decisive action, assuming that diplomatic negotiation would be her only approach. They raided outposts, attacked caravans, and attempted to destabilize the region's economy. Initially, she responded with tactical restraint, gathering intelligence and avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. But when the rebels captured one of her envoys and publicly humiliated him, the queen recognized that hesitation would be interpreted as weakness. What followed was a calculated demonstration that she understood the psychology of warfare as deeply as any general. Instead of ordering a swift military sweep, she designed a punishment aimed at breaking the insurgents' morale. Her forces encircled their stronghold, cutting off escape routes and supply lines. The queen then issued a decree demanding the surrender of the leaders, accompanied by a threat that seemed almost ritualistic in its phrasing. Chroniclers describe how she invoked ancestral traditions, framing the rebels not as political opponents, but as violators of sacred order who endangered the future of the entire realm. When the rebels refused, she proceeded with a punishment that shocked even her own commanders. She ordered the destruction of key structures within their territory, not indiscriminately, but with deliberate symbolism. Buildings that represented authority, council halls, ceremonial pavilions, and armories, were targeted first. These acts sent a clear message. Their political identity would be dismantled before their bodies ever faced judgment. Once the stronghold fell, the leaders were captured and brought before her in a temporary field court, where she remained composed and unflinching. The punishment she imposed was harsh, even by the standards of that era. The rebel leaders were sentenced in a way designed to fracture the cohesion of their followers. Some were executed publicly, their deaths staged in locations where symbolic meaning ran deep. Others faced exile, stripped of their titles, families divided, and influence erased. The most devastating part of the decree, however, was directed at the land itself. By reallocating territory to loyal factions and establishing fortified settlements, she ensured that the rebellion's foundation would never reassemble. Her actions transformed the region's perception of her. For those who witnessed the punishment, she was no longer a distant ruler defined by palace politics, but a strategic force capable of shaping the fate of entire populations. Her approach demonstrated a chilling understanding of fear as a tool of governance. By punishing not only individuals but the very symbols that sustained their authority, she dismantled the rebellion's psychological infrastructure. The insurgent territories, once confident in their ability to defy her, now understood that resistance would not bring negotiation. It would bring erasure. This event strengthened her reputation across the empire. Rival tribes hesitated before challenging her again, and border territories began reinforcing their loyalty. It was clear that her rule was not sustained by brute force alone, but by her ability to manipulate the emotional and cultural foundations of conflict. And as the memory of her punishment spread, the empire settled into a tense but stable quiet, shaped by the knowledge that defiance could trigger consequences far beyond the battlefield. The fifth case draws us into the private chambers of an imperial court, where danger did not always come from foreign borders or rebellious provinces, but from within the family itself. In this world, blood ties were not shields, they were traps. A dynasty was a battlefield disguised as lineage, and every successor, every sibling, every cousin was a potential rival, shaped by ambition and whispered promises. The empress at the center of this case understood that her greatest threats were not distant enemies, but members of her own household who believed the throne should never have rested in her hands. Her rise to power had been complicated, marked by political maneuvering, strategic marriages, and alliances that fractured as quickly as they formed. She navigated a palace where every corridor concealed a spy, every banquet a potential betrayal. When rumors surfaced that a younger relative, one with a growing faction behind him, intended to overthrow her, she recognized the pattern instantly. She had seen predecessors fall because they hesitated to confront threats wrapped in family dignity. She would not make the same mistake. The plot was subtle, built around poisoned relationships and carefully cultivated loyalties. The young rival positioned himself as a protector of tradition, claiming that the empire needed a ruler whose bloodline carried a truer right to reign. Messages were carried in coded language through servants, gifts exchanged with hidden meanings, and promises made to military officers who felt uneasy under female leadership. The empress watched it unfold, allowing the conspirators to believe their scheme remained invisible. All the while, she prepared her response with chilling clarity. When the moment came to act, she summoned the family to what appeared to be a ceremonial gathering. The great hall was adorned with ancestral symbols, tapestries depicting victories of past generations, and torches arranged in symmetrical rows to cast long shadows across the marble floor. The atmosphere felt like a celebration, but beneath the surface lay a tension that only she fully understood. Once the entourage assembled, she revealed the evidence: intercepted letters, witnessed conversations, and testimonies that exposed the plot at every layer. The hall fell silent as the accused relative realized the trap had closed. The punishment she ordered has been debated for centuries, not because it lacked clarity, but because it carried an emotional brutality that historians struggle to capture. Execution would have risked martyrdom, given the conspirators' noble blood. Imprisonment alone would leave open the possibility of rescue or another uprising. Instead, she employed a method designed to remove him entirely from political life without staining the dynasty with bloodshed. Chroniclers describe how he was subjected to a physical penalty that ended his capacity to rule, stripping him not of life, but of legitimacy. It was a punishment that resonated far beyond the palace, sending a message that even within the imperial family, disloyalty would be met with consequences that outlived the perpetrator. After the sentence was carried out, she reorganized court positions, reassigning roles to those whose loyalty had remained steady. She ensured that the memory of the rebellion was preserved in official records, not as a shameful family incident, but as evidence of her strength and clarity as a ruler. The empire responded with a blend of shock and respect. Some viewed her action as ruthless, others as necessary, but all understood that she had reinforced her throne in a way no assassin or army could counter. This case exposes the emotional cost of ruling in a world where affection and ambition collided so violently. It shows how a leader, cornered by forces born from her own lineage, could transform vulnerability into decisive power. And before we move ahead, I want to hear your perspective. What do you think about rulers who punish members of their own family to protect their throne? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how far a leader should go when the threat comes from within. When we step back and place these 5 punishments side by side, a deeper pattern begins to emerge, one that reveals far more about power than about brutality alone. These queens and empresses came from different empires, eras, languages, and religions, yet the architecture of their decisions shares unmistakable echoes. Each operated in a world that questioned her right to rule, and each responded with measures that fused strategy, symbolism, and psychological force. Their punishments were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were calculated moves crafted in systems that demanded unwavering dominance from those who dared to occupy the throne. One of the clearest patterns is the intentional staging of authority. These women understood that power was not simply held, it had to be displayed. Whether through public executions, ritual ordeals, demolished territories, or ceremonial confrontations, they turned punishment into a performance with specific audiences. Some spoke to the nobles, others to the common people, others to rival factions or foreign powers. The message was always the same: loyalty is rewarded, treason is destroyed, and the queen's rule is not open to negotiation. Societies where a woman's legitimacy was doubted from the moment she took the crown. These displays filled the void left by prejudice, constructing authority where tradition refused to grant it. Another pattern lies in the overlap between religion and punishment. Many of these rulers used divine symbolism not to mask cruelty, but to elevate justice above personal motive. The blending of sacred ritual with political consequence amplified the seriousness of the crime while distancing the queen from accusations of vengeance. If the gods were judging, then she was merely their instrument. This tactic shielded her from criticism and stabilized her rule in cultures where male-dominated priesthoods often controlled public morality. By mastering religious narrative, these women shaped not only the law, but the spiritual lens through which their actions were judged. A third thread connecting their decisions is the strategic targeting of symbols. These rulers did not always strike hardest at people. They often struck at the structures that sustained opposition. Rebellious cities saw their ceremonial centers demolished. Conspirators lost not only their lives but their legacies, stripped from archives and public memory. Family rivals were punished in ways that dissolved their claim to power rather than turning them into martyrs. Each act reveals an understanding that authority depends as much on perception as on force, and that dismantling the image of a threat can be more decisive than eliminating the threat itself. We also see a shared sensitivity to the psychological landscape of their kingdoms. These queens did not rely on brute strength the way male conquerors often did. Instead, they manipulated fear with precision. They recognized when silence would be stronger than spectacle, when ritual would intimidate more than violence, and when a punishment needed to resonate across generations rather than end with the death of the guilty. Their decisions reveal a form of power shaped not by physical dominance, but by emotional and symbolic mastery, an approach that reshaped the political fabric of their empires. Finally, there is the unavoidable question of how history chose to remember them. Many chroniclers, influenced by cultural expectations and gender bias, exaggerated their severity, highlighting their punishments while minimizing their achievements. Yet when we look closely, we find that male rulers who committed far greater atrocities were often praised as decisive, strong, or visionary. These women, facing similar pressures, were branded monstrous. This double standard complicates every account we read. Are we witnessing their cruelty, or the discomfort of patriarchal societies confronted with female authority that refuse to bend? These patterns form the framework through which the next layer of the story must be understood, a layer where myth, fear, and political agenda merge, shaping not only how these punishments occurred, but how they survived in the fragile corridors of memory. As we move closer to the heart of these narratives, the line between what truly happened and what was carefully constructed becomes increasingly difficult to see. Ancient history is full of shadows, and when those shadows fall on powerful women, they tend to stretch and distort even further. Many of the most shocking punishments attributed to female rulers come to us through layers of interpretation: hostile chroniclers, foreign diplomats, rivals, factions, moralizing priests and storytellers whose goal was not accuracy but influence. The result is a historical landscape where truth and propaganda often blend so seamlessly that separating them becomes a challenge in itself. In countless cultures, women in power were viewed as deviations from the natural order. This meant that any display of strength risked being reinterpreted as cruelty, and any act of political necessity could be reframed as emotional excess. A male ruler ordering executions might be praised for decisiveness, yet a queen making the same decision could be depicted as hysterical, vindictive, or bloodthirsty. Chroniclers used language that emphasized unnaturalness, describing female severity with moral judgment rather than political context. This linguistic bias shaped the historical memory of these rulers long after their kingdoms faded. Consider the sources through which many of these stories reached us. In Europe, monastic scribes recorded history from the perspective of institutions that distrusted female authority. In the Middle East, political accounts were often written by defeated rivals who had every reason to vilify the queens who overcame them. In Africa and Asia, oral traditions sometimes exaggerated the ruthlessness of queens, as cautionary tales meant to enforce social norms around obedience and gender roles. Even diplomatic reports sent between courts routinely distorted events to justify alliances or provoke conflict. When multiple biased lenses record the same story, the distortion becomes indistinguishable from the event itself. Some punishments attributed to these women may have been amplified over generations, evolving into legends that overshadow their original scale. A public execution becomes a massacre. A symbolic ritual becomes a demonic ceremony. A calculated political move becomes evidence of uncontrollable fury. The transformation is subtle at first, then complete, leaving behind a mythic version of a queen who becomes less a historical figure and more a moral symbol, either of danger or of power abused. These exaggerated depictions served political purposes long after the ruler's death, reinforcing patriarchal narratives that discouraged female ambition. Yet the opposite can also be true. There are instances where the cruelty recorded in chronicles aligns with archaeological evidence, suggesting that some rulers indeed embraced severity as a central pillar of their reign. In these cases, the brutality was not invented but preserved because it served as a warning, a justification, or a moral lesson for future generations. Even so, the motivations behind the punishments often remain obscured. What appears monstrous at first glance might have been a reaction to mutiny, foreign threat, or internal collapse. Without full context, the punishment becomes detached from the crisis that produced it. Understanding this intersection of myth and reality is essential when studying the women, whose actions shaped entire empires. Their stories remind us that history is not merely a record of events, but a battleground of interpretation. Each queen's reputation reflects not only what she did, but what others needed her to represent. Her image became a tool, used to inspire, to intimidate, or to caution. And as her legacy traveled through time, it absorbed new meanings, shaped by the fears and desires of the societies that retold her story. These blurred lines prepare us for the final question at the center of these narratives. What is the true cost of ruling through fear? And how does that cost echo through the generations that remember, distort, or erase the women who dared to wield power with unflinching authority? When we finally reach the end of these intertwined histories, another pattern rises from beneath the narratives, one that forces us to confront the deeper human cost behind every decision those rulers made. Each of these women, whether empress, queen, or military sovereign, inhabited a world where mercy could be interpreted as weakness and hesitation could open the door to collapse. Their punishments, shocking, theatrical, strategic, or spiritually charged, did not exist in isolation. They were responses to political climates where danger moved silently through the halls of power, where trust was a fragile currency, and where every choice carried consequences that shaped generations. What emerges is less a portrait of individual cruelty and more a map of how power behaves when it is contested, doubted, and relentlessly scrutinized. For these rulers, punishment became a tool not only of justice, but of survival. In their hands, it could preserve the integrity of a kingdom, dismantle a rebellion before it ignited, or reassert legitimacy in the face of hostile elites. But the effectiveness of these actions did not erase the emotional weight behind them. Some of these women ruled through fear because they knew no other language would be heard. Others resorted to harsh measures because their authority was constantly undermined, requiring decisions that male rulers executed without facing the same moral scrutiny. The psychological toll of ruling in such an environment often goes unrecorded, overshadowed by the spectacle of the punishments themselves. As we follow their stories across continents and centuries, it becomes clear that their legacies were shaped not only by what they did, but by how their actions were later framed. History magnified their severity, sometimes fairly, often strategically, turning these rulers into symbols of danger or warnings about female ambition. Yet beneath the exaggerations, the distortions, and the myth-making lies a recurring truth. Their reigns forced societies to confront what leadership demands, when tradition insists that a woman should not lead at all. In the vacuum between expectation and reality, these rulers forged identities powerful enough to survive not only their enemies, but the centuries of narrative that sought to diminish them. What lingers is a question that reverberates far beyond the ancient world. If power always extracts a price, what does that price look like when the one who wields it must constantly fight to justify her right to hold it? The answer is not simple, nor is it comfortable. It is woven into the stories of queens who stood unflinching before conspirators, rebels, priests, and rivals, shaping their kingdoms through decisions that still unsettle us today. Their punishments carved their names into history, not only for their severity, but for the clarity with which they exposed the fragile structure of authority itself. And if you stayed with this journey until now, that speaks to something deeper. These stories are intense, layered, and challenging, but they also reveal how much the past still echoes in the present. If this exploration brought you new insight or made you rethink the way power is judged, take a moment to subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter of this historical deep dive. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I stayed until the end," so I know you were here with me through every step of this walk through ancient power. And if the narrative connected with you, tap the like button in a natural way, the same way you would react to any story that kept you thinking long after it ended. There is another video waiting for you right beside this one that continues unraveling the hidden layers of the ancient world. So click and come along as we push deeper into the shadows where history keeps its most revealing secrets.